Hi everybody, thank you so much for being here for Napa County Historical Society's lecture series. Today we're with Ralph DeAmicis, who is a tour guide and an author. He has some short stories to share with you from Napa and Sonoma counties. I'll let you take that away, so I know you have quite a bit to share, and we're all excited to hear that from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Well, good evening, everybody. I should give you a little bit of backstory about the stories come from our book, Wine Country in Shorts, the stories of Napa and Sonoma, and how this came about. And I co-write with my wife, Lonnie, just so you understand. I don't do all this by myself. Quite a few years ago, we've been professional speakers for 30 years now. We were out here at a big conference in San Francisco, and after we came up to wine country to relax for a bit, and we just fell in love with it. And we said, this is beautiful. And we were lecturing about buildings at the time, and ergonomics and feng shui, and we were fascinated by the winery buildings. So we decided we would move here from Philadelphia, because there's no snow here and a lot there, and we would write a book about winery buildings. This was going to be great. This is going to be a great project. Well, we come out and we're going around and we're making no progress on the book. People just don't know anything about the buildings, or they can't take the time or anything else. But then one day we're outside of a winery, I think it was Stag's Leap, and there was a tour guide there, a guy in a black suit, big tall gentleman in a black suit. And I walked over and said, where are the cool wineries, like great buildings? And he knew everything. He knew all about the places. And I realized the tour guides knew a lot, so I got a little part-time job in between our speaking and our writing and our businesses to tour around the area, and while my clients would go inside to taste wine, I would run around with my camera and my notebook, right? And after a year, I changed companies. I went to a different company, so I toured different areas. And after 2 years of it, we had the first book done, but it wasn't the book of winery buildings. It had morphed into our first tour book, because there were no good winery tour books, which I found out as a tour guide. So now we're 7 editions into that, and we're the producers of the top-selling wine tour books in the region for 17 years now. But someplace along the way, I guess about 2 years in, Lonnie says to me, you're getting really grumpy. Why are you so grumpy? Her desk is like next to mine. It's kind of hard not to notice. And I said, I missed seeing my friends at the wineries. I miss being outside. I miss being with my clients. And she said, we should start a business. So we started our own little tour business. We still run amazingly enough all these years later. And as we were touring around, now I had all the flexibility. First of all, I didn't have to wear a black suit. That was nice. So I could walk into the wineries, and this is back in the days of the tasting bars. So I would come out and I would stand behind my clients at the tasting bars, up against the wall sometime, and I would listen. Because the tour guides, the people who were pouring, the hosts really, would have stories. And they would tell you about the winery and the land who started, but they'd tell you about the history of the area. And their whole job is talking. That's what they love to do. And over the years, I kept hearing these great stories about this region. And I'm from New Jersey, which has more Revolutionary War. Lonnie and I lived in Philadelphia for many years, obviously another historic place, but I was amazed by the history here. And so as I remembered these stories, I would tell my clients the stories. And typically I'd tell them the stories between wineries, which is usually about 15 minutes. And you have to have at least 15 minutes between wineries, because you need time for the wine to metabolize a little bit. You can't just go from one tasting to the next. You have to give that alcohol a little bit of time to get used up. And in that period of time, I would tell them stories about wherever we were. So wherever I was at, I would have some story I had heard about that region. And then someplace along the way, I realized I'd been telling these stories for years. I did them automatically, and they were great stories. And so I decided we should really write them down. So about 5 years ago, we decided to write them down. But I couldn't write them down. And we've written, I think, 22 books, 40 books, something like. We've written a tremendous number of books in 5 different categories. But I was so used to saying these. Worse yet, I was used to saying them over my shoulder that I couldn't write them down. So what I would do is I started dictating them into my phone with a UTalk It Types program. So if you ever want to write a book and you don't want to sit, just talk it into your phone. And then when I was waiting at the next winery, then I'd go through and I would edit on my phone, and then I would send it to my computer at home, and then work from there. And the thing that was really funny was I realized these stories were much longer than I realized. They were much longer. I'd been telling little 15-minute segments from here to there. But the stories, they had a lot more depth to them than that. So when we started writing them down, they got a little longer. We tried to keep them not too long because they're really short stories, hence Wine Country in shorts. And they're just lovely. And because the reason they're lovely is they are the fabric of this place. It's the way that this place, which was once the ends of the earth, this is where you sent your redheaded stepchild to go. See how they do, because if they do great, that's fantastic. If we would never hear from them again, well, that's okay. It was that kind of place, you had to travel all the way across the country or around the tip of South America or through Panama, through the jungles to get here. It really attracted unusual people, very brave people, sometimes eccentric people, sometimes foolish people, but interesting people. You never get bored here. If you ever notice that, the people here are never boring. And as I've told these stories over the years, I've also realized that in many ways it's the quintessential American story because it is about audacity, it is about hope, it is about ingenuity. And so I'm going to share parts of different stories with you. I'm not going to read one whole story because I want you to get an idea of the scope of this. One of my favorite stories, and I always like to start with, is of course the Golden Gate. And the Golden Gate's a funny story because everyone comes in out there and go over the bridge. It's one of the most photographed bridges in the world, right? People don't realize it was very hard to find. In fact, the Spanish knew it was there. They knew there was an inlet to a bay there when they came past, but they probably passed it on the way back from the Philippines. Because what they would do is they would leave the coast of Mexico, they would sail across 6,000 miles across the Pacific to the Philippine Islands, the Spice Islands, get their spice, and then follow the northern route back, the currents, back to the coast, and they would land typically along the coast of Northern California. Then they would sail all the way back down again to Mexico to transport it overland to send it back to Spain. This is how valuable these spices were. Well, when they came down the coast, they knew there was a bay there, but they couldn't find it. Why? First of all, the fog, right? The fog is just horrendous sometimes. Second of all, it's only a mile wide. The opening at the Golden Gate is only a mile wide. And if you're offshore, you see basically the hills of Berkeley behind it, Alcatraz Island and Angel Island, and it looks like a solid wall. Then to make it worse, the two biggest rivers in the state both come out through there, so the water has whirlpools and swirls, and they'll take a little boat down. And just to make it more entertaining, right off the coast there is where the great white sharks mate. So it's shark-infested, tumultuous, fog-bound waters, and you can't see anything anyway when you can see it. So there was no way they could see it because they stayed far offshore. The way they finally found it, and why did they know it was there? I forgot to mention that. The Chinese treasure fleets had mapped the world in the early 1400s. 7 fleets went out. It was sent out by the emperor who built a major portion of the Great Wall, who built a major portion of the Grand Canal. He basically enslaved millions of people in order to do this, built 7 fleets out of teak, and sent them all over the world to map the world. And they mapped the coast of California. They found the Golden Gate, they found the bay, they traveled all the way up to Sacramento. In fact, they found a teak ship under the silt in Sacramento with rice still in the holds. And when the Spanish arrived there, the native people were growing rice. And they taught the Spanish how to grow rice. These were part of the tribes. Back in the 1800s, an anthropologist who was paid by the state found a tribe in the Russian River Valley that only spoke Chinese. These were all the sailors who were left behind. When the Spanish arrived here in the 1500s, they reported seeing junks sailing off the coast. They knew the junks from the Indian Ocean. They'd seen them there. But these were the sailors who were left behind who built their style of boats. So when the Chinese came back, they created these maps, they created these charts, and one of the places where they found them was in Calcutta. That was established as a Chinese trading base along the coast of India. The Venetians traded through there. They brought the maps, the charts back to Venice. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, in disguise, went to Venice and smuggled them out, brought them back to Portugal, and started a sailing school. And using this, they sailed around Africa to the Spice Islands, because otherwise you had to go through the Arabian lands and it was too expensive, it was too controlled by other people. They went around it. They went from being the poorest country in Europe to being one of the wealthiest in 50 years. from this navigation, but this was all the Chinese. So the Spanish, by this point, they had these charts. They knew it was there. They just couldn't find it. Finally, in 1776, kind of a notable year, there's a group of soldiers and one Franciscan father down in Half Moon Bay, and he sends them north. He said, go out to Point Reyes, because we know Point Reyes is there because Sir Francis Drake landed there. So go up and find it. And remember, Sir Francis Drake landed along the coast, claimed it for England, missed the Golden Gate by like 10 miles, right? And you had to realize, for these captains, all they really wanted to do was find a great bay with wonderful rivers, because that would make their fortune. 10 miles. All you had to do is take a walk. He would have found like the world's greatest bay, right? 10 miles. So the soldiers are going north, and they're told to go to Point Reyes, and they get up to the inlet, and they can't find a way to get across. They don't have a boat. They're not sailors. And they're really upset because they've been told to go to Point Reyes. They can't get there. They go back, they're like crestfallen. They said, we're so sorry we couldn't get there. There was water in the way. He reports this back. They've realized they found the Golden Gate. They found the entranceway, right? So what happens next? They need to send a ship. They know where it is, so they're going to send a ship up. They had this packet. Packet is a supply ship, and this supply ship is ready to go up the coast and supply Monterey, and they're going to have the captain look for this at the same time. One problem, the experienced captain, for some reason, goes crazy. He loses his mind. They have to carry him off the ship. So they put the person in charge, the 21-year-old lieutenant, right? Tell him, go up north, find this, right? They're sending him to this maelstrom with sharks and, tumultuous waters, but go find it, right? But he's young. So they go up and they find the entranceway, they dock off there, he sends his first mate in, and the first mate goes around, he comes back and says, there's a big bay there. They go in, and they spend weeks and weeks mapping the bay using longboats and befriending the local tribes. But that's how they found it finally, thanks to the Chinese. They literally fell over it. So, and of course, poor Sir Francis Drake, right? He went all the way around the globe looking for something like this and missed it for 10 miles. And to make it even worse, they have to name the hotel for him in San Francisco, right? Really? Insult to injury. But on the other hand, they've been using his name for years, so if he did come back, I'm sure he could get the best suite, right? Don't you think? So, raid the minibar. He was a bit of a pirate. So I love the Golden Gate story because, it's the most photographed bridge in the world practically, and yet the story behind it is just really remarkable. Now, another story I love because it ties in different cultures is the story of the Silverado Trail. The Silverado Trail is really unique, and it wasn't always called that, but it travels up along the eastern side of the Napa Valley, up against the hills, the dry part of the hills. And you always kind of wonder why it's there, and everyone who comes there, everyone goes up Highway 29, which is known as St. Helena Highway, which you would know if you drew as many maps as I did on all of our tour books. But everyone goes up there and then gets stuck into traffic, and all the smart people, the locals, they all take the Silverado Trail back and forth. But the Silverado Trail was the original trail. That's what was originally there, and why? The name Napa, people say, well, Napa was the name of a village, and Napa was this and that, but outside the region, for the other tribes, Napa meant bear. And it didn't just mean bear, it meant grizzly bear. It meant the big bears, right? Why? Because this area had the biggest population of grizzly bears anyone had ever seen, right? So the tribe who lived with them had to be pretty fierce, which is why the Spanish called them guapo, or guapo, for fierce. So why did they use the trail over there? Because the bears didn't like that neighborhood. The bears, it's like, where does the 500-pound bear go? Wherever they want to go. Where's the grizzly bear go? Wherever they feel like, right? And they liked the valley floor. They liked where it was green, and they liked up on the Mayacamas Mountains, and all the way over into Sonoma. They liked that region. They didn't like the dry hills over there. That was just too dry. So that's why the Silverado Trail was there. People could go back and forth and not get eaten by bears. There were mountain lions. They were less of an issue. Bears are more of an issue. So why did they need that trail, though? Why was it so important? The tribe that was to the north was known, the Spanish called them the Guapo, but the original name is the Onasai. And it means the outspoken ones, which is kind of a bit of a pun. But the And the valley was called the Tahalusi, which meant simply the beautiful place. All the way at the top of the valley, there's a big deposit of obsidian, black volcanic glass. You have to remember that at the time when the Spanish arrived here, the native tribes were living in the Stone Age. They'd missed the Bronze Age. They missed the Iron Age. They were living in the Stone Age. And the obsidian is the sharpest object on the planet. It can be sharpened to one molecule across. And that's what they were trading. They were great artisans, and they would make all kinds of tools out of the obsidian. Then they would travel down the Silverado Trail, walking trail. A lot of it went up into the hills, came down, because the valley would flood during the wintertime. And then they would come down to where the downtown is today, which was known as the Ferry Village, but also flooded. And here, the Patwin tribe made the sakas. They were their reed canoes, and they would trade for use of the sakas. And then the tribe, the Onisai would travel down the river to where the Carquinez Bridge is. And the name Carquinez comes from the tribe that was there called the Carquinez, and meant the traders. And they would trade with them. But sometimes they didn't want a better deal, so they would travel all over the bay. They found obsidian from here as far south as Los Angeles, as far east as Utah. That's how valuable it was. And there's stories of the Onisai showing up all over the place. In fact, there's a great story that they showed up in Santa Cruz, and the Franciscan friar said, "Oh, well, if you're going to trade with us, you have to become a Catholic." They said, "Fine, no problem. Make us Catholics." They did all their training. Next morning, they hopped in their canoes to leave. He said, "Where are you going?" He says, "We're done. We're not going to stay here and be your slaves. That's silly. We're the Onisai. We don't do that kind of stuff." And they sailed away. They were very, very fierce. But on the other hand, I always think the name Onisai is funny. It means the outspoken ones. I've been doing sales since I'm 16 years old. I've been making things or selling things since I'm 16 years old. You have to be very outspoken if you're a salesperson. And I realized maybe they just were saying, maybe they were the good salespeople. Maybe they were just noisy and they went out and sold all the time. But they would travel back and forth up and down this trail. Now, later on, during the gold rush, one of the things they needed was mercury, because mercury is used for pulling the gold, separating the gold dust from the ore. They found there's quite a bit of mercury inside the valley, and they found large deposits of it all the way at the top of the mountain, what we call Mount St. Helena today. The original name of it was Mayacamas, which meant many springs, and as we know, right around the base of it is all the Calistoga Springs. So when they would travel up, in fact, they'd go on the trail, and eventually they established that into a road, and that became known as the Silverado Trail. And there's two different stories to that. In wine country, there's always three versions to any story, just so you understand. People drink a lot here, it's a middle, but there's also time changes the story. The original thing they were mining was mercury. The name of mercury at the time was quicksilver. So it became the Silverado Trail. Then, of course, later on, they discovered silver on the hills, and it really got stuck as Silverado. Now, one of the stories I love that relates to this beautifully is the fact that Mercury, the planet Mercury, is always considered the patron saint or patron planet of writers and healers. And as we know, in the 1800s, this was the major spa. This was the health spa for the West Coast. Everyone came here to get their health back. And two of the people who came to get their health back were Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny Stevenson. The story is interesting because Robert and Fanny met in England, and he was very much in love with her and asked her to marry him. And the fact that he was skinny and smoked too much and drank too much and probably didn't have much money was probably not the reason that she said no. That would be enough of a reason, but the reason that she said no was she was already married, and her husband was back here in California. And she was planning on getting a divorce, but she said no, and so she left. Gets on the sailing ship, lands in New York City, takes passage across the country, arrives here, skin and bones. He's a man, Robert Louis Stevenson's a poet. He's a poet in love. I mean, he follows her. He has to raise the money, he follows her across the ocean, across the country, arrives, skin and bones also. Finds her, she says, okay, I'm divorcing my husband. She divorces her husband, they get married, they have their first night of their married life in the Palace Hotel. All their friends say to us, you two look like death warmed over. You have to get your health back. Go up to Napa. That's where people get their health back these days. It's good air, it's good water, good food. So they go up and they stay at the St. Helena Hotel. The building is still there. And, but after a week, they can't afford to stay. That's $10 a week. That's a lot of money. And some people there tell them about a cabin up on, a 2-story cabin up on St. Helena, on the Mount St. Helena. And so they go up there and they camp out. And this was their first home as a married couple. And they were there for several months. And they traveled all over the area. And the thing that's kind of remarkable to me, and you have to realize I'm a tour guide. I didn't intend to become a tour guide. I kind of backed my way into this profession, but I'm a tour guide. And the way they got around was because people befriended them. There was a stagecoach line that ran up and down the Silverado Trail. And there was a particular stagecoach driver who was very tall, which in those days would have been known as Long something. His name was John. So he was known as Long John, and because he ran the Silverado line, he was called Long John Silverado. And of course, as we know from the famous Treasure Island, that's the name of the pirate. Now, Lookout Mountain was based upon St. Helena, their first home, right? And I've always wondered if he wore a patch, you know, or had like one leg or something like that. Like, you know, Charlie Parkhurst, the famous stagecoach driver who was in all the dime novels for years, wore a patch on one eye because she lost an eye to a whip, you know, or he lost an eye to it. But it was only after he died that they realized that Charlie was Charlene, the woman that he was known for his great talent with horses. But the story of, you know, they were here for 2 months before they finally moved on, but this was their first home. And it was really, you know, thanks to this tour guide, the stagecoach driver, that got them up to the Schramsberg winery and got them up to, you know, Petrified Forest and to all these different places that he then wrote the book, The Silverado Squatters. Remember, Mercury, Silverado, is the patron of writers as well. And that really made Napa very, very famous. The other thing that made Napa famous, which is interesting too, which is a related story, but it's going to veer off a little bit, and it's part of a different story. There's a story called the Three Jakes. And when you go to the northern part of the county, they always say it's the story of the three Jakes. It was Jacob Schramm, Jacob Grimm, and Jacob Berenger. And the thing that really helped out Jacob Schramm and his wife, he was from Germany. He was a barber, in fact. And he worked at the spas. He cut people's hair at the spas. And his wife, though, was from here. She was a good German-American girl born here in California. They got married. They bought the land up on the hills because that's what a barber could afford. And then they transformed it into this beautiful winery. So when Robert Louis and Fanny visited them, they were amazed by this beautiful property. But when he wrote the book, it got them a tremendous amount of attention. And they were there for many years. And then the winery, you know, was vacant for many years. And then the Davies families bought it in the 70s. And when they bought it, they weren't sure what they were going to do initially. And Jamie Davies, the wife, went all around the area. At that time, there were like 20 wineries. She went all around the area, and you could talk with all the different people until she learned a lot about winemaking by dropping in places. Well, she drops in by Berenger. And Ed Spraggi, who's the head winemaker, is showing her around, and they get to this big tank. It's like, you know, man high. It's a big tank, and on the front it says Schramsberg on the front of it, carved in the wood. And she says, what's this? What's this doing here? Oh, said, well, there's a story that goes with that. Back in the 1800s, the Coit family was here. Lily Coit, you know, Fireball Lil, had their house up there, and during the summertime, writers and everyone would come there, and this was a favorite place for people to get together. Well, one night, Jacob Schramm was playing cards with Jacob Berenger. And Jacob Schramm had a really good hand, but was getting a little low on cash. So he bet these two tanks. Jacob Berenger had a better hand. And the next day, they were carted off to Berenger. They'd been there since the 1800s, right? She says, can I buy these from you, please? Can I buy them? No, they're not for sale. What he didn't tell Jamie was that they were just making a deal at that time, selling to Nestle. And they didn't want to say, oh, the tanks weren't included. Tanks were not included, sorry. So he didn't say anything. Well, the winery changes hands, and about 6 months later, Jamie gets a phone call, and it's Ed's secretary. Ed says that if you'll come by on this date and play cards with him, maybe you can win the tanks back. Huh? Oh yeah, come by. Oh, by the way, wear something nice. Okay, bring a truck. Okay. So she shows up, and there's there in front, if you've been to the Barringer Winery, there's that big open space in front of there, and there's the tanks. They're all polished up. They're looking beautiful. There's television lights all around. There's cameras. All the assistant winemakers there. There's a table set up with the green felt and all the stuff you need for a card game. And what's going on? They're using this as a publicity thing, right? So they're about to sit down and play cards, and Jamie goes over to Ed and says, "There's only one problem. I've never played poker in my life. We could play, I don't know how to play poker." And Ed whispers to her, "Don't worry, just play the cards we hand you." So now when you go to Schramsberg, they're there underneath the light in a place of honor. So, love that story. Now Schramsberg had started off making sparkling wine. They got a phone call from the State Department. They said, "We need 20 cases of wine." "Really?" "Yeah, but can you bring them to the Air Force Base?" "Really?" "Okay." They don't tell them that 20 cases of wine is 1/5 of their production for the year, right? They bring them over to the Air Force Base. They sign for it. That's all they know. They get a check from the State Department. 3 weeks later, they get a phone call from a friend saying, "Get on the phone, get on the TV right away. Barbara Walters is on TV holding up a bottle of your wine in Tiananmen Square. Nixon brought this to the banquet when he opened up China." Of course, they sold out the rest of the sold out the next year, and the next year, because suddenly this little winery that no one knew about, this is the second time that someone writing about stuff or someone doing something special changed the fate of the winery. So it's really, really remarkable. It's just a great story. And it's really a story of friendship. Okay. Let's see what other stories we have. Oh, the story of Mount St. Helene. Who named it? This is one of the great points of contention. Who named Mount St. Helena? I have 3 or 4 different versions of that one. If you're in Napa, because the story's different from each side of the mountain, just so you know. And you have to realize, we recently took this book and we split it into 2 pieces. One's our favorite stories of Sonoma, and the other one's our favorite stories from Napa. And the reason was, I realized after 17 years of publishing in the area that the stores in Sonoma will not sell a book if it says Napa anyplace on the cover, and vice versa. No, just not happening. So the other day I just divided the 2 books and said, it took me this many years to remember that little point, okay? But Mount St. Helena. If you read anything in Napa, the person who named it was a Russian princess. And of course, it's amazing how many times to me that, I guess not that amazing, that clients will say to me, "Why is it called Russian River?" Like, "Oh, there were Russians there? There were really Russians there?" And I have to explain that there was a Russian base there in the 1800s. It was because they couldn't feed their people up at the sealing bases up in Alaska, so they sent 2 ships south and established a base there to grow food. And they brought back down Kodiak natives and in their canoes to go hunt the sea otters, and then the women stayed behind and they would grow the food on the property, and they were there for many years. But they always say it was a Russian princess because she was. Ilona de Gagarin was her name, and she was she was the niece of the Tsarina. Very beautiful woman, beautiful blonde woman, which, in this part of the world, when do you see a blonde at that time, especially? And she was in love with a very handsome count, a very talented man. I mean, a poet, a scholar, a warrior. He was just handsome, madly in love with him. But he was like several steps below him, below her, Ilona. So the Tsarina did not approve of the wedding, of the marriage. Well, she married him anyway. Everything dries up for him completely in Russia, and the only posting he can get is in Alaska. So he takes his wife, his children, and he bundles them off to Alaska. right? As far as you can get from Moscow, St. Petersburg. Well, he gets there, and luckily the governor kind of takes pity on him and says, well, I really need someone to go south and establish a base. So why don't you and your wife and kids and take 2 ships and go down there and establish base? So they go down to where? Eden, compared to Alaska. They go down to this paradise. And they arrive here, and at the time, General Vallejo over in Sonoma, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, our commandant, has been told to don't let anyone else in, chase the Americans out, chase the Russians out, don't be nice to anybody. He's got like 30 men to his entire group. He's a nice guy. He's also born in the sign of the crab, by the way. He was born July 5th, but he always said he was born July 4th because he wanted people to see he was aligned with America, because he really believed that America was the future of California. And so instead of like chasing the Russians out, he went and befriended them. He invited them by for dinner. In fact, it did cause a bit of a problem because Chief Solano, who was a good friend of his, who'd grown up in the mission, had been kidnapped as a child from the Suisun Valley, and grew up in the mission. He grew up to be a 6'6" tall, brave, and became known as Chief Solano. Was enraptured by Ilona Gagarin, and was going to kidnap her. And General Vallejo found out about this and said, no, you can't do this because everyone will come after you and the tribes. You cannot do this, and convinced him not to. So while they're there at the base, they had all the luxuries. They had a piano, they had all the luxuries, and they ran the base, and it was a wild base because it was a fort with cannons but no soldiers, which was bizarre. They would like every time they get too drunk, they would shoot off the cannons. Yeah, I know. They apparently, the bookkeeper complained about all the gunpowder they were going through, and all the alcohol probably. So supposedly the story is that she and some men brought her bodyguards, traveled to Napa, climbed the mountain, put a plaque there with the name of the Tsarina, the Tsar, and the governor, and the name's Mount St. Helena, right? And that's the story, that she climbed the mountain. But in truth, there's another story, which is it was her husband who climbed the mountain and named it after, it's kind of a little bit of a pun, after her, because Helena is Ilona. But also, Saint Helena was the patron saint of the Tsarina. So I think this was part of the plan for Helena to write to her aunt and say, "Dear Auntie, I have named a mountain after your favorite saint. Can I come home now, please?" But that's just one story. The two of them possibly, and that I could believe that. But I was told by an anthropologist from Fort Ross, which his real name is Fort Rus, because it means Rus as in Mother Russia. Another California, some English and Russian together. That no, it was called St. Helena before then. And Altamira claimed that he named it. Well, the thing was, Altamira was a bit of a scaredy cat. He was audacious, but he only got up as far as like the edge of the bay here before he realized the tribes were really mean to him. They just did not like him, and he was eventually sent back to Spain. But I think that other people were traveling in the area and saw the mountain, because when you're in the Russian River Valley, you're in Santa Rosa, you can see Mount St. Helena across the hills, and it looks like a sleeping woman. And the story is that it was named St. Helena after because he had a Franciscan father had seen a sculpture at a church in a valley where the patron saint was St. Helena, and so he named it after St. Helena. And that's the other story. And that probably when they came back to him, well, the thing about the Franciscans, they were great map makers. They were great navigators. That's why they were here. They were great map makers, and made them good leaders. And so he probably wrote it on the map. It's like Amerigo Vespucci. America got named after him because he wrote his name on the map. Same kind of thing. The third story, which is really interesting, is that there was an English sea captain who had arrived in San Francisco Bay with a lot of money. A lot of this area, Napa especially, was settled by sea captains because they could come up here on their ships. And he bought the land that was St. Helena. He bought that mountain, basically. And the ship he had arrived in the harbor, was named the St. Helena. So 3 different people claim to have named the mountain. The one thing we do know for sure, she knew what she wanted to be called. That's where the mountain knew what she wanted to be called. You know, it's interesting, I mentioned about the Franciscans being such great navigators. This is mustard season around here. We all love mustard season. It tells us, you know, oh, spring's not that far along and far away, and you know, it's all this beautiful mustard is coming up. That's not native to here. That was a navigator's trick. It actually goes all the way back to Roman times. When the road makers and the people who laid out the roads in ancient Rome would travel, they would carry a bag of mustard seeds over their shoulder or on their wagon. And as they traveled, it would have a little hole in the bottom, and it would leave a trail of seeds behind them. So in the springtime when they came back, because you'd always come back in the spring, you know, during the winter they'd hunker down, they could see where they had traveled by these trail of yellow flowers. It's the same thing the Franciscans did. So that's why in all the oldest roads in California, you always see mustard along the side of the road. It was left there by the Franciscans. With a little navigation trick. And then we're the beneficiary of it. Of course, here, why do we use it? Because it's very high in phosphorus. So it makes the skins of the grapes very bright, you know. And it also keeps away bugs and things like that. We always want to keep away bugs. Oh, this is interesting. You know, because we grew up in cars, our generation grew up in cars. I'm from New Jersey. Everyone in New Jersey grows up in cars. We have more cars per capita than any place else in the country. We kind of forget how important rivers are. And Napa's a river town. Sonoma, downtown Sonoma isn't. I remember years ago, George Weber, who's a great historian, saying, oh, well, downtown Sonoma was a backwater because there's no river, which is why they have all the historic buildings there. They couldn't afford to replace them. Napa, they could afford to replace them because Napa was always prosperous. But the river was a really big part of this. And of course, it's a tidal estuary. You know, it has a tide to it. But the fact that it was a river town, one, allowed the tribes to go out and trade, but allowed these sea captains come in. And what was interesting is that when the first ones came in, this was still Spain. This was still Mexico. This was not America. These people were from all over the world. And a lot of these early settlers were from Europe. For instance, right now we have the exhibit running of the great buildings. Inglenook, of course, is one of the great buildings. Hiram McIntyre, the great architect, you know, who built some of these great buildings, he was working for these people who ran these huge shipping companies. And they loved it because they had their offices in San Francisco. They could take their own boats and come up here and supervise this. Now, what's interesting is that when they first started building wineries here, it's not like we have a lack of materials. We've got tons of redwood, and it's resistant to bugs and it's resistant to water, and so they were building the wineries out of wood initially, and it was working great, except that they started using Chinese labor, and the Chinese would build it much more cheaply. The problem was up in St. Helena, there was a group of Swedish carpenters, and they felt, well, they're the tree worshippers, they felt that was their business. So after they would leave, the teams would leave in the day, the Swedes would sneak in and burn the buildings down. Well, after a while, the ship captains got a little annoyed with this. They said, look, we'll build in stone. But the problem was the Chinese were not stone builders. What they needed was the Italians. And of course, the Italians were all from Sonoma. Sonoma had a massive influx of northern Italians, and they were the stone builders. In Italy, a stone floor is normal. A marble floor is normal. A wood parquet floor, that's luxury, because they don't have that many trees. So they bring the Italians over. They build all these great buildings. And if you ever go to the great Ivy League colleges, Ivy League universities, those were all built by Italian masons as well. And then all around the towns, there's all these old Italian families because they were there for so many years. It's the same thing here. Once you go north of St. Helena, it's Italy. It's all these old Italian families. Why? Because they came here to build the wineries and they said, oh, land's cheap, let's buy land. And the thing about rivers is that when people settle, whoever gets there first settles closest to the river. So right along the river was like the Spanish. Gaetano, the person who sold the land to Coombs, lived right by the river. Coombs came in later. He bought the land right here where we are, laid out the town. 6 months after he lays out the town, a man walks into the general store with a big golden nugget and says, "I'd like to buy something with this, please." The gold rush had just begun. The only way you could get to the gold rush country was through Napa, and during the wintertime, all the miners came here with their money. So the land values doubled every 6 months for 5 years and made Coombs a very wealthy man. Now, the next group that came in were, of course, the French came in, it was the Spanish, then it was the Americans, and then the Prussians came in. That's why they settled up in St. Helena. They were further away. And then the Italians came in, and they were the ones furthest north. And that's how it's actually laid out. When you go to any country, you'll find these bands of cultures further and further away from the river, from the coastline. Same thing in Brazil, same thing in the East Coast. So when you get to the northern part of the valley, you have this really interesting thing that happened. In the 1970s, a little more recent history, in the 1970s, we have, people start realizing, geez, we can grow great grapes here. And the people who first realized this were the agriculture department. They said, oh, we could grow fantastic grapes here. We have to get people to do it. So they went to the legislature. And they said, can you do something about this? So they said, sure, we'll give them grants. We'll give them money. We'll give them whatever they need for their equipment. And whenever you go to any of the wineries, and they started in the early 70s, they always say, oh, well, Mr. Winarski developed a great interest in grapes at this time, in wine. Not mentioning the fact that they could get all this free money, and they were in a place that now was an agricultural preserve, so it kept their taxes artificially low. So, low taxes and free money, okay, that would convince me to grow grapes, don't you think? So they start growing grapes. And at that time, they were still using a rootstock that went back to the 1800s. It's called the St. John's rootstock. And back in the 1800s, when they first started planting a lot of European plants here, they would do well for about 10 years and then they would die. And it was because there's a bug that goes after the roots. And so there actually was a botanist in Texas, in Grapevine, Texas, who figured out which plants you could graft. And so they figured that out and they saved the industry. And so everyone's been using the same rootstock since the mid to late 1800s. They get to the 1970s and say, we could do better than this. And so a company develops a new rootstock, and the head of UC Davis tells everyone, oh, this is a great rootstock, you should use this. And people start planting with it. But the people who plant with it are the wealthiest wineries, the Mondavis, the Beringers, Sterling, all these big wineries start planting with it. You know who doesn't plant with it? The hard-headed Italians in the northern part of the county. I think it's just because they were cheap. I get to say that because I'm Italian on both sides. The term technically is called duce testa, it means hard-headed. But it was also, they would say, the kids would say, oh, we should plant with this. It gives you better production. It's very resistant. It's going to do great. And the father would say, my no-no didn't use this. My biz-no-no didn't use this. We're not using this. And so they didn't plant it. About 10 years in, this new rootstock starts failing. Just about the time when they should be making money. And all these properties end up changing hands. That's when Sterling was sold and Newton started a smaller winery. The only one who didn't sell, in fact, was Mondavi, and he did it by going public. But it was just a disaster for them. Know who didn't lose a vine? The hard-headed, cheap Italians in the northern part of the county, which is why when you go up there, you find all these old Italian families that still own that property up there. And it all came down to this one rootstock about this, how did this affect them? And why did they end up all the way up there? Because they were the last ones to come in on the river. So let's see, what other stories do we have? And there's 22 chapters in here, just so you know. River towns, who's that? Great buildings, yeah, we actually had 2 chapters on great buildings, because remember the original book was supposed to be about buildings? They were both big chapters. And I realized that I'm hitting people over the head with this one. I gotta stop that. The Judgment of Paris. That story's been told so many times, but I have to tell it again because so much gets left out of this story. The original, when you hear the story of the Judgment of Paris, the tasting in 1976, in which the French wines were competing with the American wines in France, and the Americans did so well, yeah. And it was all the people who were noticed were men. It was Tarnas, the guy who owned the wine shop, and the writer who wrote about it. It was all the men who did this stuff. Not even close. Not even close. First of all, it wasn't them that organized the whole tasting. The person who actually organized the tasting was a woman who worked in the wine shop. And it was not just a wine shop, it was the first wine school in France. It's kind of hysterical that France, which is known for wine for hundreds and hundreds of years, had no wine schools, like how to taste wine, how to understand wine. They didn't have it. An Englishman had to start the class in Paris. Who does he have working for him? An American woman from Delaware. She was a member of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, right? And every year she would go over to the embassy and she'd ask them for bottles of wine. And they'd bring it back, and then they would compare them to French bottles. And they'd do a comparison issue, and they'd bring French wine critics in, and they would do tasting. And the Americans always did horribly because they were mostly New York wines or from the East Coast, because the Californians weren't exporting their wines. They didn't have any California wines. Well, it's 1976. We lived in Pennsylvania in 1976. I lived close to American Revolutionary battlefields in 1976. Everyone was in costume. It was a big thing. It was a big thing for her. So she wanted to do a better tasting. And she talks to her boss about this, and they say, we're hearing about these great wines coming out of California. So he and his wife fly to California on vacation. And they get here, and the person they find to drive them around is a woman who is a tour guide who brings groups of winemakers from California to France. This is her business, and they'll say she has connections. So once again, it's another woman. They get here. She drives them around to all of her favorite wineries. They buy the wine for the tasting. They pay full retail, even though they offer them a discount. Of course, the bottles are like $6, but still, pay full retail. And they get it ready to be shipped back for the tasting. They're on the way back. It's due to be shipped. It's stuck. The wine is stuck here. They're running into all kinds of problems shipping it. It's getting closer and closer. They go back to the tour guide, say, can you help us? Guess what? She's just about to leave for France with a group of 50 winemakers, all the families you would know from this area. They're all about to leave. They bring the wine down to the airport, and each one of the couples carries 2 bottles onto the plane and carry it over. And they're all people who know how to handle wine, obviously. So it arrives here in pristine condition. They bring it to their store, and the wine critics all come in, and they're very respected people. They set the bottles out, and all the years before, they just kind of put the bottles out. But this year he says, these wines are really good. He gets paper bags, cuts holes on the top, and puts them on top, so you can't see the labels. And they start tasting. And it got in the news because there was one guy there who wrote for the New York Times who loved going there because he got free wine. So he was there for the tasting. And they're tasting their way through, and as they're tasting, the writers and critics are saying they're recognizing the wines. Oh, that's the Latour. I recognize that Latour. It's from '72. And they're mentioning all the different wines they're recognizing, and they're giving them the highest scores. And they get to the end, and then they take the bags off, and they've just given the top scores to all the American wines. Of the top 5, they gave 3 of the top wines were American wines. Stag's Leap got the top red. Chateau Montelena got the top white. They were floored. In fact, one of the critics, who was a woman writer, suddenly realized what had just happened and took her scores back. And the American woman who had arranged this was really kind of appalled that this had happened, because it wasn't meant as a competition. It was meant just only as a friendly tasting. But guess what? The results were the results. And the group that was over there included some of the people whose wines were on this table. And Andrei Cheselchev, the great Russian winemaker, head of Latour, or head of who Latour had brought over for BV and for Buena Vista, was leading them around. And it was actually the woman tour guide, who had convinced his wife to convince him. He didn't want to do it. He finally convinced his wife to convince him to do it. And so they're touring around, and they're having a big lunch at this beautiful winery, and then the phone call comes in that they've just beaten the French. And Andrei says to everyone, shh, don't say anything, because we're going to insult our hosts if we say anything at all. So everyone kept it very, and they get back on the bus, and celebrations just took off because they realized what had just happened. Now, the thing that's really funny about this, of course, is that it made Napa famous, right? But the wines from Chateau Montelena were not really Napa wines. And the reason was 1/3 of the grapes came from Napa. The other 2/3 comes from the Russian River Valley. They come from a little family up there. He was a dentist. She was, I think, a librarian, and they'd been growing wines for years. You know, a lot of people had this was their second business, and they've been growing grapes. But he was full time, so she was the one managing the vineyards. Now so Mike Gergic is the way you really should say it if you're Croatian. I was told that by Croatian clients. Came by to look at grapes, and now Mike stands like that tall, but she stands that tall too. And so they're standing next to these vines. And when I first went there, the vines were still there. And the vines are that tall too. I mean, they're all like here. And there's a great picture of them, you know, getting the grapes. And he's a hard bargainer, but she was really hard too. But they bought like a bunch of grapes from them. But the only problem was they only had this tiny little VW bus truck, right? The old VW, I mean, massively underpowered. And they're on the other side of the mountains. And she has to deliver it. So she has to load up all these grapes in the back of this tiny little bus, head over the mountain. She said the only way she could get over the mountains was by getting a running start as she went up Petrified Forest Road and floor it and hope no one got in front of her, because if they did, she was going to be stuck. And she had to do this twice. But she was the one who sold the grapes to Mike Gergic to make the wine. Now, the other thing that I thought was wonderful was that where did the other grapes come from? The other grapes came from right over just south of Yountville from a winery. And I was there one time, and it was called the Hannah Muir Vineyards. And I didn't connect it when I went there. But we're inside the house, and I look on the wall, and there's these two beautiful landscapes, just gorgeous, gorgeous landscapes. And I love art, and I grew up around going to the Met and such. I'm looking at these pieces, and I said, where did these pieces come from? Oh, well, our grandfather was John Muir, and he had introduced this artist to, you know, Yosemite, and to say thank you, he gave him these two paintings that had been passed down for us. And that was the third batch of grapes. So the story with all three grapes was just magnificent. But like I said, Sonoma, it was years before Sonoma got credit for their spectacular grapes for the Judgment of Paris. How are we doing for time?
3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes left. Then we have to invite Caitlin back. Boy, it flew by. I had another. Well, thank you. I had okay.
You have a little bit more time.
Okay. Oh, good. I had about another 15 chapters to go. So.
I don't think he has time for another.
Okay, I'll come back up then.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We really appreciate it. That was really interesting. And thank you, Lonnie, for recording. This talk will be available so after editing. So please check out our website, social media for that. And I'll be making my station debut. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, so it'll be available there as well. And coming up here, we have on February 28th, a siren. On February 28th, we have Gather at the Goodman with Napa County Landmarks. That will be a talk right here about our current exhibit, the Valley Beautiful Architecture. And then the final Gather at the Goodman will be March 14th. Information can be found at napahistory.org. And then on March 1st, we'll be at the Women's History Crawl in Sonoma Barracks, or at the Sonoma Barracks, I should say. So look for us there, and we hope to see you there. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And thank you again.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
It was a pleasure. Okay. Okay. I guess I'm not doing the other 15 stories.